in June 10, 1944, Normandy. The ground still shook from the Allied landings, but for one German panzer commander, the real thunder was yet to come. The morning began with calm. A mist hung over the hedgerows, damp and heavy, muffling every sound except the slow rumble of tank engines. Hauptmann Karl Mayer sat in the commander's seat of his Tiger Woody, scanning the tree line through his binoculars. Around him, the fields of Normandy stretched in waves of green, broken by stone farmhouses and narrow dirt roads. He had fought in Russia, at Kursk, where he had faced hundreds of T-34s and lived to tell the tale. He trusted his Tiger, 57 tons of German steel, a monster that had turned battlefields into graveyards for enemy armor. But this was France, and here the enemy came from the sky. His radio crackled. "Panzer column, advance to St. Lo, maintain spacing, expect contact with Allied armor." Karl nodded. "Jawohl," he muttered, turning to his driver. "Let's move." The Tiger lurched forward, its treads crushing the wet earth, leaving deep grooves behind. All around, other tanks followed, Panthers, half-tracks and fuel trucks. The road ahead wound through narrow French countryside. Civilians had long fled. Only the crows remained, circling high above. Karl's gunner, Dietrich, hummed softly. An old marching song. The men were tired but confident. They had armor, they had discipline, they did not yet have fear. Then came the sound. At first, faint. A distant rumble, like thunder rolling over the hills. The men froze. Karl leaned out of the turret, scanning the horizon. The sound grew louder, deeper. It wasn't thunder. It was the growl of engines, fast ones. A young loader pointed to the clouds. "Herr Hauptmann, look!" Tiny silver dots shimmered in the blue, too many to count. Karl's stomach dropped. "Flugzeug," he whispered. Planes. But not the slow, clumsy bombers they had faced before. These moved with purpose, slicing through the air like hunting birds. And then he saw the shape. Wide wings, round nose, gleaming under the sun. P-47 Thunderbolts, the Americans, the dreaded Jabos, fighter bombers. "Get under cover," Karl shouted into his radio. "Disperse, schnell." Too late. The first P-47 came screaming down from the clouds, its dive so steep it looked like it would crash. Then a flash of white trails. Rockets. The ground erupted, the tank ahead of Karl's vanished in a wall of fire, flipping on its side like a toy struck by a hammer. The explosion threw dirt, metal, and men into the air. The shockwave rattled Karl's Tiger. "Move! Move!" he yelled. The driver slammed the throttle, grinding the gears. The heavy tank crawled forward, but the road was too narrow, the trees too close. Another roar came, deeper, angrier. The next P-47 passed so low, Karl could see the pilot's helmet, the white scarf whipping in the wind. The Thunderbolt opened fire. 8 50-caliber machine guns tore through the air, spewing molten death. The sound was deafening, a ripping roar that shredded everything in its path. Bullets tore through the half-track behind them, punching holes in armor like paper. Men dived into ditches, screaming. Karl ducked inside the turret, heart pounding. The armor clanged as rounds struck, sparks flying like fireworks. "Gunner, target that plane," he barked. Dietrich swung the turret up, but the Thunderbolt was gone, climbing again, looping high into the clouds before rolling over for another dive. "They come again!" the loader shouted. Karl looked through the periscope, and his breath caught. There weren't 2 planes, there were 12. They came in waves, screaming down from the sun. Each one unleashed rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire. The sky itself seemed to roar, the earth convulsed, flames leapt from fuel trucks, shells exploded, black smoke rose in thick columns that blotted out the morning light. Carl's Tiger rocked violently as a near miss shook the ground. The concussion made his ears ring. Inside, the men were shouting, voices lost in the thunder of chaos. "Track's damaged," the driver yelled. "We can't move." Carl's mind raced. The Tiger's armor was thick, but even it couldn't save them if they stayed still. Outside, he saw another tank, a Panther, take a direct hit. Its turret lifted clean off in a ball of fire. The crew didn't even have time to scream. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. "Get out!" Carl ordered. "Abandon tank!" The men hesitated. Leaving a Tiger was unthinkable, but one look at their commander's face, pale, eyes wide, and they obeyed. They climbed out, stumbling over the side, diving into a ditch as the next wave came. The P-47s swept in again, this time strafing the wrecks. Their guns cut through metal and flesh alike. The ground shook with every burst. Carl pressed his face into the mud, hands over his head, the sound of bullets tearing the earth inches away. For 30 endless seconds the world was nothing but fire, smoke, and the scream of engines. Then, silence. The planes were gone. Only the echo of destruction remained. Carl lifted his head slowly. The air stank of oil and blood. The road was littered with burning vehicles. Tanks twisted like crushed cans. Trucks overturned, black smoke curling into the sky. A few men crawled from the wrecks, dazed, their faces grey with soot. Carl looked at his Tiger, the symbol of German invincibility, now burning, its mighty gun drooping toward the ground. He could hardly believe it. The tank that had survived Soviet artillery had been destroyed by a single rocket from the sky. He sank to his knees. In that moment, he understood the truth. The war had changed. No armor was thick enough, no tactic clever enough. Against the Jabo, they were helpless. Over the distant fields, Carl heard the faint rumble again, fading this time, not approaching. The Thunderbolts were heading back to their base, their mission complete. He watched them disappear into the clouds, tiny specks of silver against the blue. His voice was barely a whisper. "Monsters from the heavens!" To the men on the ground, that's exactly what they were. Angels of death falling from the sun. And as the fires burned across Normandy, word spread among the German troops, a single phrase muttered with dread and disbelief. "Jabo fever! Fighter-bomber fever!" The sickness of fear that no tank armor could cure. June 8th, 1944. Normandy. The beaches still burned. The wounded kept coming. The smell of antiseptic couldn't hide the blood. It was everywhere, soaked into the canvas floors, splattered across bandages, heavy in the air like rust and rain. Corporal Evelyn Carter, British Army nurse, tightened the strap around a soldier's arm as another shell thudded in the distance. The tent trembled, dust falling from the beams. She didn't flinch anymore, not after the last 2 days. Outside, the beaches of Normandy still smoked. The sea was red and grey, littered with wrecks, helmets, and the ghosts of men who never made it past the waves. Inside the field hospital, time had stopped. There were no hours, only heartbeats. And each heartbeat might be someone's last. Evelyn moved from cot to cot, stitching, cleaning, whispering comfort to those who no longer had words. A young American soldier lay before her now, maybe 19. His face was pale, eyes half open, uniform soaked. She read the name tag, Private Thomas Blake. "Hold still, love," she said softly, her hands steady though her heart wasn't. The medic beside her, a Scottish sergeant, shook his head. "Shrapnel's deep. We'll never get it out without killing him." Evelyn met his eyes. "Then we don't stop trying." The sergeant sighed and moved on. The boy stirred. "Mum, where am I?" "Normandy, dear," Evelyn whispered. You're safe now. We've got you. He smiled faintly. We made it off the beach? You did. His eyes closed again. For a moment she thought he was gone. Then he spoke, voice weak as a breath. There's a letter in my pocket. Evelyn hesitated, then reached into his torn jacket. Her fingers found a folded paper, damp with seawater and blood. He looked at her. Please, if I don't, can you? She nodded before he could finish. I'll make sure it gets there. He relaxed, the smallest trace of peace crossing his face. But Evelyn knew peace didn't last long here. The hours blurred. Trucks came and went, unloading more wounded, more broken bodies. The doctors barely slept. The nurses didn't stop. By nightfall, the tent glowed under dim lanterns. The air buzzed with flies. Somewhere, someone was singing softly, a hymn in a voice cracked by exhaustion. Evelyn stepped outside for air. The sky was black, streaked with tracer fire in the distance. The horizon still flickered with explosions. She looked down at the letter in her hand. The ink was smudged, but she could make out the words. Dear Sarah. Her chest tightened. She sat on an empty ammo crate and read. Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. I want you to know I wasn't scared. Not really. I just kept thinking about you and about home, the porch, the apple tree, the way the river sounds in the summer. We were told this landing would be the hardest thing we'd ever do. They were right. But I saw something out there. Men helping each other, dragging their friends through fire. And I thought, maybe this is what courage really is. If I fall, don't be sad too long. I was where I was meant to be. Tell Dad I tried to make him proud. Love, Tom. The paper trembled in her hands. She pressed it against her chest, eyes burning. Behind her, the sound of boots in mud. The sergeant again. Carter, you all right? She wiped her eyes quickly. Fine, sir. He looked at the letter. That from the Yank? She nodded. He sighed. He's gone, isn't he? Evelyn didn't answer. The sergeant crouched beside her, lighting a cigarette. You can't keep them all alive, lass. I know, her voice cracked, but I can remember them. He handed her the cigarette. Then remember the ones who made it too. She didn't smoke, but she took a drag anyway. The taste was bitter, grounding. The next morning, the field hospital moved inland, following the front line. The roads were littered with wreckage, tanks, trucks and horses that hadn't survived the bombing runs. Evelyn rode in the back of a jeep, the letter tucked safely in her pocket. She watched the countryside roll by, villages half destroyed, children standing in doorways waving at the soldiers. War had turned everything upside down, and yet life still tried to grow in the cracks. At the next camp, they set up the hospital again. Same tents, same smell, same endless rhythm of suffering and survival. That night, she sat under a flickering lantern and wrote her own note. To Sarah Blake, Springfield, Illinois. Your brother, Private Thomas Blake, fought bravely in Normandy. He wanted you to have this letter. He spoke of you often. She paused, then added quietly, he wasn't alone at the end. She sealed it carefully, tears spotting the paper. Outside, artillery boomed again, closer this time. The war was still raging, the wounded would still come. But somewhere across the sea, a sister would soon hold a letter that carried not just words, but a heartbeat. Days later, a transport ship left Normandy, carrying crates of supplies and bags of mail. Among them, one small envelope with shaky handwriting made its way across the Atlantic. When Sarah Blake opened it on her front porch, the summer air smelled of lilacs and rain. She read her brother's words slowly, lips trembling, the paper shaking in her hands. Neighbors passing by saw her sitting there, eyes closed, smiling through tears. The letter had done what Thomas couldn't. It made it home. Back in Normandy, Evelyn folded her uniform sleeves and stepped into the tent. A new convoy of wounded had arrived. The war wasn't done with her yet. She took a deep breath and went back to work, whispering softly to herself. The words she said every morning before dawn. For the living and the dead, I'll keep going. And under the thunder of distant guns, her voice was the only calm left in a world that had lost its silence. April 26, 1945, outside Berlin. The war was ending, but for one Luftwaffe pilot, the sky still called his name. The dawn was red, not with sunlight, but with fire. Smoke from the burning city of Berlin drifted across the airfield, blurring the horizon into shades of grey and ash. The ground trembled with distant explosions. Oberleutnant Erich Keller, Luftwaffe fighter pilot, sat beside his Messerschmitt Bf 109, hands clasped, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. The once mighty airfield of Jagdgeschwader 52 was barely more than a graveyard now. Half-buried planes, twisted wrecks, and craters where hangars used to stand. The few machines still working had been patched together with stolen parts and prayer. A mechanic approached him, wiping oil from his hands. "Fuel for 1 hour, maybe less," he said quietly. Erich nodded. That would be enough. He didn't say what they both knew. There was nowhere left to fly to. Once, Erich had believed in glory. He had been 19 when the war began, a boy who dreamed of the sky, of sleek aircraft and the promise of speed. He had flown over France, over the Channel, over Russia. He had watched friends rise beside him and vanish in flames within seconds. Now he was 27, old, in a war where few pilots lived that long. His squadron had started with 40 men. 3 were left. Inside the small operations shack, the radio crackled with static. The voice on the other end was frantic. Pieces of news from a crumbling Reich. Enemy armor advancing west of the Oder. Soviet aircraft approaching. Command requests all available fighters to intercept. Intercept. Erich almost laughed. The words sounded absurd now. They had maybe 6 planes that could still take off. No radar, no flak cover. And in the sky above Germany, the Americans and Russians ruled, thousands of them. Still the order stood. He looked at the photograph taped to his dashboard. His wife, Liesl, and their infant daughter, Hannah. He hadn't seen them in months. The last letter she sent had been smudged with tears. "Come home," she had written, "even if you have to walk." He tucked the photo inside his flight jacket. Outside, engines coughed to life, rough, uneven. The few pilots remaining gathered around their aircraft, silent. Oberst Ritter, the squadron commander, stood before them. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken. He held his flight helmet like a relic. "We fly for what's left," Ritter said softly. "Not for Berlin, not for the Reich, for each other." No one answered. They didn't need to. Erich climbed into the cockpit of his Messerschmitt. The seat felt like an old friend, worn, familiar, and haunted. He ran his hand over the throttle, the instruments, the chipped paint. The machine had saved his life more times than he could count. "Let's do it one last time," he whispered. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. Dust swirled around the propeller as the plane began to move, rolling down the cracked runway. The sky ahead was blood red. He pulled back on the stick, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he was free again. At 4,000 meters, the radio came alive. "Enemy formation, 12 o'clock, P-51s, too many to count." Eric squinted toward the sun and saw them. Silver specks glinting like blades. They were beautiful, almost unreal. Mustangs, the Americans. He swallowed hard. His fuel gauge was already dipping. His guns were half empty. But he turned toward them anyway, because that's what a pilot does. The sky suddenly erupted, tracer rounds slicing past his canopy. One of his wingmen exploded in a flash of orange, pieces spiraling away. "Ritter, I've got one on me!" someone shouted. Static. Then silence. Eric banked sharply, the G-forces pressing him into the seat. The air screamed against the wings. He saw a Mustang diving past him, its pilot's helmet catching the sunlight. He fired a burst, short, controlled. The tracers streaked across the sky, missing by inches. The Mustang rolled over and came back around. Eric could feel his heart hammering. The controls shook in his hands. He dove into a cloud, praying it would buy him seconds. When he broke through the other side, the world was quiet again. For a moment he thought he was alone. Then, a shadow above. The Mustang had followed. The American closed in behind him, guns flashing. Bullets tore through the fuselage, punching holes through the wings. Eric felt the plane shudder violently. Smoke filled the cockpit. He yanked the stick back, desperate. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught again. He could almost hear the plane begging him. Not yet. The Mustang drew closer. Through the cracked glass, Eric could see the pilot's face, young, focused, calm. They locked eyes for a second. And then, the American did something strange. He stopped firing. The Mustang pulled alongside, wings level. The pilot looked at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of weary understanding. Then the American raised one gloved hand and saluted. Eric stared, too stunned to move. Before he could react, the Mustang rolled away and vanished into the clouds. Eric's engine was failing. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. The altimeter spun downward. He knew it was over. He leveled the wings and aimed for a clearing near the forest. The ground rushed up to meet him. The crash was thunder and pain. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. Then, silence. When he opened his eyes, he was lying amid twisted wreckage. His leg burned. His hands were bleeding. But he was alive. He crawled out of the broken cockpit, gasping for air. The forest was quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. The war was closing in. He looked up at the sky, empty now, blue and endless. He thought of the American pilot, the salute, the mercy. And he wondered if maybe in that brief moment the war had already ended between them. One man recognizing another, beyond flags, beyond orders. By nightfall, Eric found a farmhouse, half-burned, but still standing. He took out the photograph of his family and placed it on the windowsill. The radio on the floor whispered the final news. Berlin surrounded, the Führer dead, the war lost. He sat down, closed his eyes, and listened to the silence. For the first time in years, it was beautiful. Days later, Allied troops found the wreck of his plane. On the side, barely visible through soot and mud, someone had painted a small phrase in chalk, "Für meine Tochter," so she may never see another war. April 30th, 1945. Berlin was dying, the sky was black with smoke, and the earth itself trembled beneath the boots of the Red Army. The streets of Berlin were no longer a city. They were a wound. Smoke rose from every corner. Buildings leaned like broken teeth. The air reeked of dust, cordite, and death. Through the haze marched Sergeant Ivan Morozov, rifle in hand, eyes red from sleepless nights. He had come from Stalingrad, from Kursk, from the long frozen hell of the Eastern Front. And now he was here, at the end of the road. Berlin, he muttered, stepping over a collapsed wall. The heart of the beast. Behind him, his platoon followed, tired men faces covered in grime, uniforms torn and dark with blood and soot. They had lost count of how many days they'd been fighting. The orders were simple: take the city, end the war. But nothing about this city was simple. As they advanced, the sound of machine guns echoed through the streets, bursts of German fire from ruined buildings. Snipers hid in windows, Panzerfausts fired from basements. Every corner could mean death. Ivan pressed his back to a wall, waiting for the next move. His comrade, Petrov, peeked around the corner, only to drop instantly, a bullet through his helmet. Ivan didn't even flinch anymore. He just took Petrov's rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and kept moving. The war had taken everything from him long ago: his wife, his brother, his home near the Volga. Now there was only this, marching forward. They moved building to building, clearing rooms with grenades and bayonets. Everywhere, the same sight. Civilians huddled in basements, old men in makeshift uniforms, boys with trembling hands holding rifles too big for them. One boy couldn't have been older than 14. He stood in a doorway, shaking, his rifle jammed. Ivan raised his own weapon and stopped. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his lips quivering. Ivan slowly lowered his gun. "Go!" he said in broken German. "Run!" The boy dropped his weapon and fled into the smoke. Ivan exhaled. "Enough killing," he whispered. By afternoon, they reached the Reichstag, the final prize, the symbol of everything they'd fought for. Soviet tanks rumbled forward, firing into the shattered stone. Machine guns rattled from every direction. The building itself seemed to bleed dust and fire. The Germans inside refused to surrender. The Red Army responded with fury: artillery, mortars, flamethrowers. The air turned orange and thick with heat. Ivan charged through the smoke, shouting, "For the motherland!" He felt the ground tremble under his boots as a shell exploded nearby. Debris slammed into his shoulder, but he kept running. The doorway to the Reichstag loomed ahead, black and burning. Inside, chaos. German soldiers fired from balconies, from behind pillars. Soviet troops stormed the stairs, their shouts echoing through the vast, ruined hall. Bodies fell on the marble floor, mixed with blood and dust. Ivan fired until his rifle clicked empty. Then he grabbed another from the ground and kept going. On the upper floor, he saw Lieutenant Sergei Yegorov holding something. A red banner, torn but still bright. "The flag!" Sergei yelled. "We'll raise it today!" They climbed to the rooftop, crawling through smoke and debris as bullets whizzed past. At the top, the view was like looking into the apocalypse. Berlin burned in every direction, endless columns of smoke rising to the heavens. Below, tanks moved through the rubble like metal beasts. Explosions flashed in the distance, and above it all the grey sky hung silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sergei drove the metal pole into the stone, hands shaking. The red banner of the Soviet Union unfurled in the wind, bright against the dark sky. Cheers erupted below. Tears streaked through the soot on Ivan's face. It was over. After 4 years of blood and death, after losing millions, the Red Army had reached the enemy's heart. That night, the gunfire finally began to fade. Ivan sat on the steps of the Reichstag, staring at the city. A German officer walked past, hands raised, surrendering quietly. Others followed, limping, hollow-eyed, their faces grey with defeat. Ivan didn't hate them anymore. He was too tired for hate. He pulled a small photograph from his pocket, his wife, Anya, holding their newborn son. The picture was worn, edges torn, colours faded. His son would be 6 now, a child he had never met. He smiled weakly, whispering to the image, "It's done. The war is done." But even in victory there was no joy. The city was silent except for the crackle of fires. The wind carried the smell of smoke and burned flesh. Petrov was gone. So were most of the men he'd started with. He had survived. But at what cost? He looked at the flag fluttering above and wondered what peace would even feel like. Was there such a thing anymore? Would he ever sleep without hearing gunfire in his dreams? He didn't know. All he knew was that the war that had consumed the world was finally over. A few hours before dawn, he walked alone to a nearby riverbank. The water reflected the fires of the dying city. He picked up a broken helmet and tossed it into the current, watching it drift away. "Let it carry the dead," he murmured, "and bring us something new." The next morning, Soviet troops paraded through the streets. Commanders saluted, photographers snapped the moment, history being captured on film. But Ivan stayed behind. He wasn't interested in parades, he just wanted to go home. He turned east toward the rising sun and began to walk, rifle slung over his shoulder, the red dawn lighting the path ahead. Years later, when he sat by the fire with his grandchildren, he rarely spoke of the war. When they asked what it was like, he would only say, "It was like chasing a storm." And when the storm ended, the silence was the loudest sound in the world. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima. A morning like any other. Then the sun rose twice. The sky over Hiroshima was soft and blue, washed clean by the summer rain from the night before. Children walked to school in pressed uniforms, lunchboxes swinging from their hands. Shopkeepers opened shutters, housewives hung laundry that glistened in the morning light. No one expected anything unusual. The war had dragged on for years, but the city had been spared from the bombings that destroyed Tokyo and Osaka. Rumors said it was because of a great shrine or because the Americans wanted to save it for peace talks, but no one knew the truth. And somewhere high above, so high the people below couldn't but even see, a silver B-29 bomber named Enola Gay was crossing the sky. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka sat on the steps outside his small wooden home, tying his boots. He had once been a pilot in the Imperial Navy, proud, young, and full of fire. But now he was grounded. His squadron had been wiped out months ago in the battles over Okinawa. He was 30 years old, with grey at his temples and a limp from shrapnel that still ached when it rained. Inside, his wife Aiko was humming softly as she folded clothes. Their daughter, Emmy, was drawing with chalk on the floor, a picture of a bird flying over a mountain. "Papa, when the war ends, can we go to the seaside again?" she asked, looking up with bright eyes. Hiroshi smiled faintly. "Yes, my little bird, when the war ends." He didn't tell her that food was running out, or that the newspapers spoke of an American invasion that would crush what was left of Japan. He didn't tell her that he sometimes dreamed of flying again, not to fight, but just to feel free. At 8:13 a.m., the air raid sirens had long been silent. A single B-29 had been spotted earlier, but the observers reported it as reconnaissance only. No one took cover. Hiroshi looked up at the cloudless sky. For a moment, he thought he saw a white speck, tiny, motionless, high above the city. Then came a strange flash. It wasn't like lightning. It was brighter, hotter, silent. For one terrible instant, it was as if the sun had exploded. Hiroshi never even had time to stand. The world turned white and then black. When he opened his eyes, everything was gone. The house was gone. The street was gone. He lay buried under broken wood and ash, his ears ringing with a high, empty sound. He couldn't breathe. The air burned his lungs. "Aiko, Emmy," he rasped. No answer. only the faint crackle of fire. He crawled through what had once been his home, his hands raw from splinters and glass. The sky above was dark now, filled with smoke and falling paper, glowing like fireflies. He stumbled into what had once been a street. People were wandering, silent, covered in burns, their skin hanging in tatters. Some carried the remains of children, others just stared at their hands as if they no longer recognized them. A woman ran past, her hair aflame, screaming for water that no one had. The river was filled with bodies. Hiroshi's heart hammered in his chest. He staggered toward the place where the school had been. There was nothing left but dust and rubble. He found Emmy's lunchbox, melted, twisted. Inside, the rice was turned to charcoal. He fell to his knees. The box clutched to his chest and screamed, though his voice made no sound in the roar of the burning city. Miles above, the crew of the Enola Gay looked back through their small glass windows. A single column of fire was rising, black, red, and boiling into the sky. The mushroom cloud reached 20,000 feet in minutes. The pilot, Paul Tibbets, said nothing. His co-pilot crossed himself. In the bomb bay there was nothing now but an empty cradle where little boy had hung. They turned toward the sea, flying home in silence. Back on the ground, Hiroshi wandered aimlessly through the wreckage, half blind, half mad. Hours passed, or maybe days. He found Aiko in what had once been the garden, her body curled protectively around Emmy's. He didn't cry anymore. There were no tears left in him. He sat beside them as the fires burned around him, holding their hands until the night came. And when he finally closed his eyes, he whispered, "Forgive us." Days later, word reached Tokyo. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. The emperor's advisors could barely believe it. Reports said tens of thousands were dead, maybe more. Some spoke of surrender, others demanded revenge. But 3 days later, Nagasaki burned too, and then the voice of the emperor came over the radio, calm, distant, divine, announcing what no Japanese ear had ever heard before. We must endure the unendurable and accept defeat. When the war ended, Hiroshi was found alive in the ruins by an American medic weeks later. He weighed less than 90 pounds. His eyes were empty, but he was still breathing. He was taken to a field hospital. He said nothing. Years passed. The world changed. He rebuilt a small home near Hiroshima's river, where the new peace memorial would one day stand. He never remarried. He never spoke of the bomb. But every August morning at 8:15 he would stop whatever he was doing and face the rising sun. He would close his eyes and whisper, "Never again." And as the years turned to decades, the children of Hiroshima grew up under that same blue sky, the same sky that once held 2 suns. They went to school, played by the river, and learned the story not from bitterness but from sorrow. Because the war that ended with fire had taught them one final truth, that no nation, no soldier, no victory is worth the end of the world.